Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. This is Revolution to Rights America at 250, a 10-episode podcast series from Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Revolution to Rights takes you on a journey through America's 250-year history of advancing freedom and justice since the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
The historical dramas featured in Revolution to Rights tell stories of battles fought in the quest for freedom and the people whose collective actions and courage inspire us to move beyond remembrance and to take actions today to ensure freedom and justice for all.
Author Lawrence Hill learned about an 18th century ledger called the Book of Negroes that documented African peoples who landed in Nova Scotia after the American Revolution. Hill's discovery inspired him to write a novel based on the people listed in the ledger, which he also titled The Book of Negroes. Hill's novel tracks the journey of the protagonist he created, Aminata Diallo, a woman who, along with thousands of enslaved Africans, allied themselves with the British Crown for the promise of freedom. The Book of Negroes takes readers from Aminata's village in West Africa through the Middle Passage to enslavement in American British colonies, on to Nova Scotia and beyond.
This episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters explores freedom and themes of liberty, family, and migration that are common threads in the histories of people of African descent in Canada and the United States. From the American Revolution to the Underground Railroad to contemporary times, Canada has symbolized a promise of freedom and new beginnings for Black migrants crossing national borders.
The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's The Book of Negroes, based on Lawrence Hill's novel, recounts the story of the Black men and women who took their chance to gain their liberty by serving on the British side of the American Revolution. In the 2015 internationally co-produced six-part miniseries, Aminata Diallo, played by Anjanou Ellis-Taylor, is kidnapped from Africa and sold into slavery in the southern United States. After the American Revolution, she makes her way to Halifax and finally to England at the turn of the 19th century. But for Aminata and other formerly enslaved Africans, true freedom doesn't come solely from words on paper. The Book of Negroes miniseries also features Academy Award-winning actor Louis Gossett Jr., who plays Daddy Moses, an African-American slave who helped lead a band of runaway slaves to freedom, and Cuba Gooding Jr. as Sam Francis, a freed slave from Jamaica who runs a tavern in New York.
We begin our conversation with Lawrence Hill. Lawrence Hill is a writer whose 11 novels and works of nonfiction have been widely read in Canada, translated into French and many other languages, and published worldwide. His novels include The Illegal and The Book of Negroes, both #1 national bestsellers, and Beatrice and Croc Harry, translated into French by Stanley Payan. His memoir, Blackberry Sweet Juice, was the first book-length memoir on Black and white mixed-race identity in Canada. Lawrence Hill co-wrote the script for the Book of Negroes miniseries, reaching millions on the CBC in Canada and BET in the U.S. He is currently writing a novel about African-American soldiers who built the Alaska Highway in 1942 through 1943. Lawrence Hill's honors include the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, 2 CBC Radio Canada Reads wins. He is also a member of the Order of Canada and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Lawrence Hill is a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph, where he has taught and mentored writers for 30 years. Welcome, Lawrence, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you so much, Michonne and Tequina. Delighted to join you.
How did you discover the historical document or ledger called the Book of Negroes that inspired your novel?
Well, the Book of Negroes, in addition to being the name of the novel, is also the name of a British military ledger that the British Navy kept when they were evacuating thousands of African Americans who'd served them on the losing side of the American Revolutionary War, who'd served the British. So the Book of Negroes is a document, a ledger, with all sorts of biographical information about these 3,000 or so so-called Black Loyalists, as in they were loyal to King George and fought the rebels, during the Revolutionary War. And so I read about it first in a book, a historical book by a history scholar named James Walker, and it was called The Black Loyalists. And it's sort of a seminal, scholarly history of the story of the Black Loyalists, who were people of African descent who were hauled out of Africa in chains, brought into slavery in the 13 colonies, made their way up to New York City to serve the British on what became the losing side of the Revolutionary War, then went to Nova Scotia, Canada, in search of freedom as a reward for service to the British, and then went back to Africa trying to insist even more fully on their freedom. And so it's an amazing story. And I first heard about it years before writing the novel in reading this book, this scholarly history called The Black Loyalists by James Walker.
In your novel, your main character, Aminata Diallo, says, "When it comes to understanding others, we rarely tax our imaginations." Creating your historical novel, you had to translate a great deal of factual information, which you just described, into creating the psychology of people living in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, we've talked about how little women's history and stories are documented. What compelled you to write the Book of Negroes and tell this story from a woman's point of view?
Well, women seem to be occupying increasing spaces in my earlier novels. And one of them just wanted to bust out and take over and claim a narrative. And it was almost happening in my second novel, which is called Any Known Blood, but I needed that particular protagonist or set of protagonists to be men for the story I was envisaging. And finally, after a few other books, I felt ready to sort of give voice to a woman, not just as a major character, but as the only narrator of the book, as Aminata holds the point of view from the first page to the last. Um, I didn't really think about writing the novel from a boy's or a man's perspective ever. When I heard about this incredible story of African peoples who were hauled out of Africa, enslaved in the Americas, got their freedom and went back to Africa in the same lifetime in which they'd been enslaved, I immediately started imagining a woman. What did she look like? How did she walk? What was her voice like? What had happened to her parents? What would motivate her in 1792 to leave the port of Halifax in Nova Scotia, Canada, and sail back to Africa, running the risk of being re-enslaved as she sailed or as she landed? And I guess I wanted to write from a woman's perspective because I wanted to imagine the person who had the most to lose. Not that boys and men didn't lose a lot too. They too were enslaved and tortured and murdered and subjugated in all the ways that everybody else was. But I wanted to imagine a person who would be a midwife, and of course, that would only be a woman at that time, and who would lose her own children to the institution of slavery, but who would have to go on catching the babies of other women, primarily white women, some of whom, were married to those who claimed to own her. And so it was really just a woman's story that wanted to bust out. And so I never really challenged that inner desire. I just went with it and started to try to imagine a woman. And I gave her the name of my middle name of my eldest daughter, Aminata, in order to imagine her more fully and really sort of feel the character.
Hmm. Now, when you're writing a historical novel, one of the things that's interesting is the interplay between the fictional characters that you create, but also people who lived in that time. So I'm curious to know who are the real or factual people in your novel that you use in order to tell Aminata's story.
Well, King George III makes a brief appearance, as does Queen Charlotte, who I've always liked to imagine was Black, and many historians think that Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, had an African ancestry. Um, Sam Francis, who was the owner of the Francis Tavern in the southern tip of Manhattan, who served both the British and the rebels during the Revolutionary War, who ended up becoming George Washington's first cook when the rebels won the war and Washington became president. Um, Many think that he's white, but I tend to interpret him as being black, and certainly his descendants say that he was black, and so I rendered him as black in the novel. Uh, John Clarkson was an abolitionist who led the kind of the movement of African peoples from Nova Scotia, Canada, back to Sierra Leone in West Africa in 1792. He becomes a character in the book. But having said that, these characters are all fictional. Yes, I relied a little bit on the grand lines of history, and I didn't have somebody doing something that was completely against the grain of history, but they become invented characters. The things they do and say and feel, the ways they express themselves, the way they enter into the plot, these are all imaginary. And I do want to stress that. And I think most novelists would say that when they're taking a quote unquote real person and turning them into a fictional character, well, they become a fictional character.
And, for our historians, even as they're interpreting actual diaries and letters, etc., they too have to, in some ways, invent the psychology of the people of the time because they weren't there, right? None of us were there when it happened. So,
Yeah, they're inventing psychology. They're also creating narratives which are invented and highly subjective. And yeah, there's no such thing as an objective history.
now our series is called Revolution to Rights America 250, and our objective was to mainly focus on collective struggles for freedom and justice. And for Black people in the American colonies who supported the British side in the Revolution, Canada and specifically Nova Scotia shows up, but it didn't turn out to be quite the promised land for them after the war. And yet, for many freedom seeking Black people escaping the American South, Canada did represent a promised land for freedom from enslavement. And we even talked with a man who is retracing the Underground Railroad. He will cross into Canada in July because of Canada's relationship with the U.S. in terms of that history. Can you talk a little bit about the connections between the Black history in Canada and Black history in the United States? And are there remnants of those shared histories for Black Canadians and Black people of the United States who still root their heritage in the United States?
Sure. Thank you, Taquina. Well, I'm very interested in this question. As you can see, um, most of my characters in all of my books are wandering around between Canada and the United States. My own family wandered around. My parents left Washington, D.C. the day after they married interracially at Howard University in 1953 and came to Toronto. Then I went back to live in Baltimore to do graduate work and have a daughter now living in DC. And so in my own family, there's a lot of movement across that border. And it's not just my family. I know of many, many people whose family histories involve straddling the US Canada border. And I think many Black folks that I know, that border is more an arbitrary thing than a real thing in terms of how they perceive family and cultural and racial connections. But to try to answer your question briefly, I mean, Black history in Canada dates back pretty well as far as it does in the United States. The first known Black person, the first documented Black person in Canada was a free man around 1603, 1605, in what was then called New France, but is now called Nova Scotia, Canada. He was serving as an interpreter between the French explorer Samuel Champlain and the indigenous peoples of Eastern Canada. And so his name was Matthew da Costa. He was of Portuguese origin, but also Black. And he's the first known Black person to be in Canada, and he was free. The first known documented enslaved person in Canada was a boy named Olivier Lejeune from Madagascar, actually, who was enslaved by a Catholic priest in 1628 in Quebec City. And so that's the first documented case of slavery in Canada, although surely others preceded it. So we have a history the Black folks in Canada. It goes back pretty well as far as it does in the United States. The institution of slavery rolled out very differently in both countries because you had, in the United States, had a climate that allowed for plantation economies. Well, in Canada, we don't have climate that allows for growing cotton or tobacco or rice or indigo, or other cash crops that drove the massive uh, economies of plantation slavery. And so slavery in Canada was primarily an urban function, people working, driving horse carriages, working as cooks, working in people's houses in cities such as Toronto and Montreal and Fredericton and Halifax. So it was an urban function, not a plantation function, and it represented a much smaller portion of the overall population than it did in the United States. Slavery in Canada also ended approximately 31 or 32 years before it did in the United States. It never had the economic foothold, the massive contribution to the American economy, that it did in Canada. But we had to fight to get rid of it in Canada too. There were serious objections from slave owners who wanted to maintain the institution. And basically, August 1st, 1834 is the year in which slavery is abolished through most of the British Empire, Canada included. So we call that Emancipation Day. And Black folks in Canada celebrate August 1st every year as Emancipation Day, meaning emancipation from the British institution of slavery. I should also say that the British, the ones who ruled the 13 colonies before the rebels threw them out and won the revolution, the British were slave owners too. And they were happy to keep their own slaves. They just like to liberate the slaves of the rebels. And so when the British lost the war and fled New York, they brought many peoples of African descent with them into Canada and kept many of them, not all, but many of them in slavery in Canada. So it's a complex history in Canada, never represented the portion of the population that it did in the States or the section of the economy that it did in the States, but it runs throughout Canadian political and economic and social history as well.
It's interesting because how you talk about how geography played a role in the kinds of enslavement. It's very similar to a conversation we had with a person of African heritage, 8 generations, Newport, Rhode Island, and said something similar about the New England, because New England also did not have the geography for that kind of plantation economy. And the other thing that's interesting is emancipation. There was a celebration of emancipation among New England African heritage peoples in August, prior to the, January 1863, are we talking about? And also Juneteenth. So fascinating,
Yes.
those connections between geography and history.
And certainly the
Uh,
British kept their interest in the Caribbean
Yes, yes.
much longer.
Yes, absolutely. The slavery lasted much longer in some other parts of the world. Another interesting difference in terms of the demographics of the Black communities in our two countries is that, I mean, all of my family on my father's side, on the Black side of the family, live in the States because my parents left the States and moved to Canada, but everybody else stayed behind. So my beloved cousins and aunts and second cousins and third and all the rest, they're all still in the States. And most Americans that I know that have Black ancestry, African ancestry, you know, descend from Africans who were brought to the Americans in slavery. And although, certainly in places like Brooklyn, you see many Haitians and others who are more recent immigrants, it seems to me that the predominant demographic among Blacks in the States is people who descend from long ago from Africa. Whereas in Canada, um, because we had a smaller portion of of Black folks as a percentage of the overall population, when our immigration policies began to loosen in the 1960s and the federal government in Canada began to let in more immigrants, including more Black immigrants, people it had sought vigorously to keep out, until the 1960s. Um, Many people from Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, Antigua, and also from East Africa, primarily East Africa, and Central Africa, or West Africa, like Nigeria, started coming into Canada. So we have in Canada a larger proportion of the Black population descends more recently from the Caribbean or from Africa than in the United States. So that's another interesting difference in terms of the demographic makeup of Black folks in our two countries.
Yeah, you have a great diaspora there. Another thing we emphasize in our podcast, we try to underscore either untold or lesser known stories that serve as the historical backdrop for films and series we talk about. And as we were just discussing, one of the themes in the Book of Negroes is migration, but there's also family and the quest for freedom. What was your journey as you went into this process of creating Aminata's story from her time in Bayo, which you said is a fictional place that you created, but I'm sure it's rooted in some other reality. And her journey, I mean, she goes on an extensive migration from Africa to the South, to New York, Nova Scotia, back to Africa, and ultimately in England. How did you track that story yourself? How did you create that journey?
Thank you, Daquina. Well, in a way, I think of the Book of Negroes, the novel, as which, by the way, was first published in the States as Someone Knows My Name, and then later republished as the Book of Negroes. Um, I think of it as a big road trip. Aminata, for her whole life, is on a road trip, and in a way, many, many, many Black folks, of African origin have been on road trips. And our story is one of migration, sometimes forced and violent, other times voluntary, sometimes seeking freedom or security or economic possibilities, other times in chains. And I'm very interested in that notion of migration. I'm very interested in migration back and forth between what is now the United States and what is now Canada. Maybe because it embraces my own family history, I've always loved to explore that. Is those borders are very porous, and in the way Black folks have moved around the world, not just the States and Canada, but all around the world, interests me. And it's a phenomenal amount of migration that the Black Loyalists experienced, just as you said, Taquina, from Africa to places such as Georgia or South Carolina, up to New York City, over to Nova Scotia, Canada, back to, in this case, Sierra Leone, to found the colony of Freetown, and then some on to England to fight for the abolition of the British slave trade. So that milk run fascinates me. And Black people are moving all around the world in their own lifetimes. And so I find this story really riveting. And to tell it from a woman's perspective was even more exciting. And I guess I'm looking to unite the Black experience rather than think of them as all distinct histories. There's American, there's Canadian, there's British. No, I like to look at them as all mushed together, which I find quite satisfying. And so I lived in Mali in West Africa as a volunteer. I've volunteered in various African countries when I was a young man. So I lived in a tiny rural, polygamous Muslim village in Mali, a very poor landlocked country in West Africa when I was a young man. And I don't think I could have written the opening scenes of the novel if I hadn't lived in the village. It really resembles in many ways the village that Aminata is born into before she's captured and sent off. Um, I didn't have a chance to go to Sierra Leone as it was still riven by violence and civil war when I was researching the novel, and also I was broke, and so I couldn't have afforded a trip to Sierra Leone at the time. But I spent a lot of time in Nova Scotia and in New York City and in South Carolina, researching the sections of the novel that take place in those places.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonneBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation.
Let's go to the series, the adaptation of your novel, The Book of Negroes, which you co-wrote the script, the screenplay. The series was produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and it premiered as the #1 show in its time slot in Canada. Congratulations. When it aired
Thank you.
in January 2015, and then it premiered in the United States on BET the following month in February, Black History Month. With that experience, what stands out for you as your most memorable moment from being part of the series or seeing your book become a visual document on
Well,
television?
one of the most memorable experiences, I don't have a lot of experience in film or TV. I co-wrote that miniseries, but it was really my only deeply engaged, professional experience in the world of television. And so I co-wrote it with the director, Clement Virgo. And much of it was filmed um, in South Africa and not too far from Cape Town, in kind of in the wine district of South Africa. And I guess one of the most memorable experiences was also one of the most personal and intimate. And I was on the set, and there's tons of people. There's cooks, and there's sound people, and there's cleaners, and there's people taking care of animals if the animals are being walked across the set. And of course, there's the director, and there are the actors, and like there's got to be 100 people working on that set at any one time. And I just thought, this book has given rise to employment for like 100 people in this place in the middle of nowhere outside Cape Town in South Africa. And I remember being delighted at just thinking of the generation of employment. And some of the people who are extras were coming on buses from the townships in South Africa for a few extra bucks a day. They were taking a long bus ride so they could be extras. And I remember feeling just so happy to see that the thing that I'd first conceived as a novel was generating work for so many people. That was a great feeling. Well, my daughter was an extra. One of my kids, Beatrice, the youngest, was a daughter, was an extra, and I got to be an extra. And just collaborating with the director, the producers, and the actors, and changing the script on the fly, even in South Africa, as actors wanted changes. It was just a really exciting thing, and it's any artist, I think, finds it exciting if another type of artist wants to recreate their work in another genre, and to have a filmmaker want to create a miniseries out of the novel was just a great honor for me, and a way to introduce the story to many people who might not have found the novel.
Lawrence, we're gonna have to look at the series again so we can look specifically
Yeah,
for some of the
where are you?
characters.
I'm
Do you know which
drinking
episode you're in?
I'm drinking avidly during a wedding scene and I'm drinking from what was, of course, an empty Scotch bottle, but I'm drinking avidly from this bottle and dancing a little bit at the wedding scene.
Who's getting married?
Aminata is jumping the broom. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So in 2024, you wrote an essay for the Globe and Mail in response to the Ontario School Board banning the Book of Negroes because the title included the word Negro. And I'm sure you've been keeping up with what's going on in the United States, all of our various conflicts around whose history is told, how it's told, who's interpreting it, et cetera. But it includes also states where you have parents who want books banned from libraries and school curriculum. Um, who or what was the Ontario School Board trying to protect, and from what in terms of banning your book? And do you see these book bans or these conversations about book bans as a reflection of ongoing debates about how history is told, particularly the painful parts of history?
Thank you. It's a really complicated and interesting question. And of course, I've been following all the book bans in the United States, and as well as what happened to me in the London District School Board, which is London is a city in Ontario. So the London District School Board banned the use of the book in schools. A book that the Book of Negroes had been read widely by high school students in Canada beforehand. Um, I mean, listen, I'm against book banning. The leaders of the Spanish Inquisition burned books as a prelude to genocide. The Nazis burned and banned books as a prelude to genocide. Um, Book banning and book burning never takes us anywhere safe or productive or civil. It never takes us to a good place. So I believe in the freedom to read, even bad books. I believe in the freedom to read and in the intelligence people make up their own minds about distinguishing between fact and fiction. Um, some people ban books that explore Black experiences because they don't want to hear about them and they feel that it intimidates or frightens or kind of devalues white folks or other folks. And in some cases, say in the United States and in Canada, there's opposition to any book that would explore Black history because we don't want to hear that voice. We don't want to hear that story, and we don't want to be made to feel bad or be judged, even if that's not my intention, of course, to make anybody feel bad. I just want to dramatize interesting history. And so in some quarters, books are being banned because the voices of Black writers, for example, are just being suppressed because certain quarters don't want to hear those voices anymore. But in another quarter, which is the quarter that affected me, you have people who consider themselves well-meaning, progressive voices who don't want children or teenagers or even 17-year-olds who are close to finishing high school reading books like mine because they contain, I'll just say to be polite on the air here, they contain the N word, and or they contain other language that is considered offensive. Maybe a queer writer is writing about their experiences fictionally and are using derogatory language because that's the language they grew up with and heard. Or maybe it's a writer from India writing about the slurs that they encountered and the difficulties they experienced growing up, say, in Canada as a person of Indian origin from from India. And so these books are being banned because teachers and educators and parents are upset to see this inflammatory language and think the students need to be protected from this language that is inflammatory. And my retort is that to ban books that contain, say, derogatory or inflammatory language is to ban the voices of those writers from those very communities. Because if I'm writing authentically about the things I know, the language that I've heard, the experiences that I've endured, then naturally some rough language is going to crop up in my literature because I'm trying to write authentically about the sounds of English that I've heard in my life. If you read Toni Morrison, if you read Martin Luther King, you're going to come across the N-word. A letter from Birmingham jail contains the N-word because Martin Luther King Jr. is expressing the hatred that he knows is coming in his direction. Toni Morrison uses it, even in her first novel, The Bluest Eye. Of course she uses it because sometimes you just need to go to that word to get at what you're trying to write. And so to ban books that contain inflammatory language is to basically ban Black authors because most serious, authentic, striving, deep reaching Black writers of novels are occasionally going to reach into that word as part of their toolkit to describe their experiences. So it's an incredibly negative in kind of fearful way of dealing with challenging books, and it prevents students from talking about those books in a neutral, polite way in school.
Yes, we spoke with the children's author, Carol Boston Weatherford, who said children are not too tender for tough topics.
Well,
Probably the
children
same is true of language, too.
Yeah, of course. The children are enduring these things. And also, come on, let's get real. Any kid is listening to hip hop is hearing the word 20 times on their way to school in the morning. So somehow we're protecting them because we don't want to see it in books, but they're hearing it all day long when they listen to their music. Hip hop is one of the most powerful and popular forms of music going today. So any child who's watching movies, watching TV, listen to music is going to be hearing that word over and over. Now we're going to prevent a neutral, polite, mediated discussion in school about that word. That's just crazy.
And no one seems to be arguing about taking Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn off the
Yes.
bookshelf or off the but that's why I'm so grateful to Percival Everett for writing James.
Yes, I read that book and I really enjoyed it. I especially like the code switching in the book and
Yes.
how James is sliding around in the register of human expression and sometimes sounding downright scholarly, and other times swearing like a soldier. And so I really enjoy the code switching in that novel.
The key is the reason why people are pulling these books, it's I think perspective is what is the issue here because it's okay if it's from Mark Twain's perspective of how he sees Black people and, his character's transformation around race and perceptions around race, but from the person from the Black perspective, I think that creates some tension for people.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree, Mishan. And many people, many, don't want to hear the Black perspective. For whatever reason, it's being suppressed, and it's being suppressed more and more vigorously. In both of our countries. So, as a writer and as a parent, as a professor, my goal is to open up the doors to reading, not to shut them down.
Well, we're happy to include your novel, The Book of Negroes, in our From Page to Screen book picks for summer reading and beyond. And as part of our Revolution to Rights America at 250 series. But I want to talk to you about your parents, Dr. Daniel Hill and Donna Hill. Apparently, they have inspired you in so many ways, and their story has inspired your writing work, the work you do as a scholar, as a teacher, your life. But they were also co-founders of the Ontario Black History Society, and that's really big. Talk about the way their work inspired your work. What made you want to follow their example in delving into the Black history of Canada? And are there stories that you would like to see from experiences or the stories that your parents were collecting or the Ontario Black History Society was collecting created into another series like the Book of Negroes was adapted into a series?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And well, my father, Daniel Hill, was a Black man, born in Independence, Missouri. He was the son of a Black minister in the AME Church. His name was also Daniel Hill. He was a dean of theology at Howard University. This is my grandfather. And he also traveled around the country before becoming dean of theology at Howard. He traveled around the country ministering in AME congregations, basically in Denver and in Oregon and in Berkeley and so forth, Independence, Missouri. So my father kind of grew up all over the place and then ended up being drafted into World War II. And my grandfather had also served, as an officer in the American forces in World War One. My father was doing his PhD in sociology at the University of Toronto after the war, went back for a year to teach at Morgan State in Maryland, and met my mother, in an interracial housing co-op in Washington, D.C. They fell in love. My mother was working for the Democratic Senator Herbert Lehman and was also doing civil rights activism in DC at the time. Uh, Clothing stores that had food counters in the basements, they would go in and splash ammonia on the counters to drive away customers because they were segregated establishments and they were protesting racial segregation in its food counters in department stores in DC. So she was really on it, as a young woman having recently graduated from Oberlin. They moved to Canada the day after they married and settled in Toronto, which also was a difficult place for an interracial couple, but not quite as bad as DC. And they both wrote books about Black history. They founded the Ontario Black History Society. My father created the first human rights commission in Canada called the Ontario Human Rights Commission and worked there for some years. And they were really excited about Black history in the world, and including in Canada, which became their adoptive country. And they told us stories and stories and stories about these things. And so they definitely infected me with their enthusiasm for Black history. And the thing that excites me is to find little known stories that involve connections between African Americans and African Canadians and find ways to stitch those together in surprising ways in fiction. And again, most of my novels do involve characters who are moving across that very porous border. And even the novel I'm working on today involves the story of African American soldiers in 1942 working to build the Alaska Highway in the far north of Canada during World War II. And so I'm very interested in in these movements of people across that border. And I guess I can attribute that excitement to my parents who loved history, who loved the surprising nuggets of history. And for me, I mean, all the color was bleached out of history when I was being taught history in school. It was so boring and uninteresting. And my job as a novelist is to excite readers about the fascinating and forgotten parts of history, including, you know, the history of Black folks, which is also the history of Canada and the United States.
The Book of Negroes is available for streaming for a fee. Do a search to find it online. Also, check your local public library. Lawrence Hill's novel, The Book of Negroes, is one of this podcast's 9 from page to screen book picks for summer reading and beyond. You can find the book in our affiliate bookstore on both the From Page to Screen and Revolution to Rights bookshelves. Go to our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to find the link to the affiliate bookstore and on the webpage for this podcast.
This podcast wraps up the 5th season of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Catch up on podcasts you missed. Visit historical sites, museums, and exhibits to feed your curiosity for history that are part of the historical backdrops for the dramas featured in Season 5. Let us know what you're watching. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on what we're watching and podcast news. We'll be back in the fall with Season 6 of fascinating historical drama conversations, including the final 2 Revolution to Rights America at 250 podcasts on historical drama with the Boston Sisters.
Enjoy your summer, a great time to read about and visit the places where history happened. Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening.